April 12, 1981, Keddie, California. 36-year-old Sue Sharp, her 15-year-old son John Sharp, and John's 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate are found brutally murdered inside cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort. Sue's 12-year-old daughter Tina Sharp is missing, and her skeletal remains would be discovered in a remote area 3 years later. Sue's two youngest sons, along with a family friend, spent the night in a separate bedroom and are left unharmed. Over the years, the investigation would uncover two promising suspects who happened to occupy another cabin at the resort, but no one is ever officially charged with the Keddie Cabin murders. After that, the trail went cold.
Happy Halloween, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host, Robin Warder, and yes, by happy chance, October the 31st just happens to fall on a Wednesday this year. We've been releasing special Halloween-themed episodes all this month, but we wanted to go all out to commemorate this special day. Last month, we put up a poll listing some of our creepiest, most highly requested cases we've been asked to cover on the podcast, and let our listeners vote on which one they wanted to see featured on our Halloween episode. The winner? The Keddie Cabin murders. That voice you just heard narrate our opening was Kelly Campbell, one of the winners of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest. As you probably know, the Trail Went Cold has a monthly contest in which listeners can win the chance to narrate the intro on one of our episodes. But much like our 100th episode earlier this year, we thought we'd do something special again. So instead of selecting one winner for this particular contest, I picked four: Kelly Campbell, Stuart Davis, William McCormick, and Stephanie Kurtz. Yes, I originally picked 5 people in our last random draw, but I've been unable to get in touch with our 5th person, so hopefully I can arrange for them to make a voice cameo on another episode in the future. Anyway, you just heard Kelly narrate the intro, and throughout the course of this episode, the other 3 winners will make voice cameos and narrate passages of the story. So today's featured case, the Keddie Cabin murders, is one of the more infamous unsolved murder cases of the modern era. It's an appropriate choice for our Halloween episode, since the horrific nature of this crime seems like something out of a horror movie. There were 4 victims here, one of whom was not found for 3 years, but one of the most bizarre aspects of this story is that there were 3 other kids who spent the night in the cabin and were left unharmed, and one of them just happened to be the stepson of the prime suspect. While most people familiar with this case have a pretty good idea who did it, there are still a number of unanswered questions. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, here is Stuart Davis to introduce us to the Keddie Cabin murders.
Our story begins in 1981 in Keddie, California, a small community located near the Sierra Nevada. One of our central figures is 36-year-old Glenna Susan Sharp, who goes by the name Sue. Sue is the mother of 5 children: 15-year-old John, 14-year-old Sheila, 12-year-old Tina, 10-year-old Rick, and 5-year-old Greg. 18 months earlier, Sue had been living in Connecticut, but became separated from her abusive husband, James Sharp. He kicked the entire family out of his home, so Sue decided to take her 5 kids and move to the other side of the country. They eventually wound up at a trailer park in Quincy, California, where Sue's brother lived. In November 1980, the Sharps decided to move 7 miles away to the Keddie Resort and rented Cabin 28, which became their new home. Sue shared one bedroom with her 2 daughters, Sheila and Tina, while Rick and Greg shared the other bedroom and John slept in an unfinished room downstairs. While Sue did hold a few part-time jobs, it was a financial struggle to support herself and her children, so she was mostly forced to rely on a $250 monthly allotment check she received because her husband was in the Navy, along with food stamps and a small stipend from enrolling in a California Education Training Act program.
On the afternoon of April 11th, John Sharp decided to hitchhike to Quincy alongside a 17-year-old male friend of his named Dana Wingate, who was living in a group home at that time. The plan was for Dana to spend the night with the Sharps once they returned. That evening, Justin Smartt, a 12-year-old friend who lived in Cabin 26 with his family, also came to sleep over with the Sharps, while Sheila decided to sleep over with a family named the Seabolts, who lived next door in Cabin 27. Tina spent much of the night hanging out with the Seabolts, and also wanted to sleep over there, but her mother would not give her permission to do so. So Tina left and returned to Cabin 28 at around 10 p.m., but sometime within the next 10 hours, an horrific crime would take place. Shortly before 8 a.m. on the morning of April 12th, Sheila woke up in Cabin 27 and decided to walk back to her own cabin in order to change clothes. When she walked inside, she was shocked to discover that there was blood everywhere, including the walls, ceiling, and furniture, and 3 bodies were on the living room floor. One of them was Sue Sharp, who was lying near the sofa, nude from the waist down. While there were no signs of sexual assault, Sue had been gagged with her own panties and a bandana, which were secured to her face with medical tape. Her hands and feet were bound with medical tape and electrical cord, and her body was covered with a blanket taken from her daughter Tina's bed. Sue had been stabbed in the chest several times, had her throat slashed, and was struck on the side of the head with a blunt object, which appeared to be the butt of a Daisy 880 BB rifle, though the actual rifle itself was never found. Since the medical tape did not belong to the Sharps, the perpetrators had likely brought it with them. The other 2 bodies in the living room were John Sharp and Dana Wingate, who had returned home from Quincy at some point during the night. Like his mother, John had his throat slashed, while Dana was manually strangled. John's hands were also bound with medical tape, while Dana had tape around his wrists which had been broken, but electrical cord was used to tie both of the boys' ankles together. The one thing which all 3 victims had in common was that they each suffered blunt force trauma when their heads were struck with a claw hammer. It seemed likely that 2 different hammers were used in the attack, but only one hammer was found at the scene, resting on top of a wooden table next to a bloody butcher knife. A bloody steak knife was on the floor, and its blade was bent in half. While there were no signs of forced entry, furniture was knocked over, the phone was off the hook, the lights were turned off, and the drapes had been closed. There were also slash marks on the wall to indicate that someone had been violently stabbing it. Sheila immediately ran back to Cabin 27 for help, and one of the resort's owners called the police. Sheila and members of the Seabolt family then went back to Cabin 28 to check on the other children. They looked inside the bedroom window to see that Rick Sharp, Greg Sharp, and Justin Smartt were unharmed. All 3 children were removed from the cabin through the window in order to spare them from having to see the gruesome scene inside the living room. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office soon arrived, and the investigation would be overseen by Sheriff Doug Thomas, who would eventually call in the California Department of Justice to help him. Surprisingly, it would take them several hours to figure out that the remaining Sharp child, Tina, was nowhere to be found. Justin would later claim that when he was initially questioned by a detective, he tried to tell him that Tina was missing, but was ignored, creating an unnecessary delay in the search for her. Tina's shoes, jacket, and a shoebox containing a school project she had made were missing from the cabin. Traces of blood were found inside the bedroom, which Tina shared with her mother, and the bedroom the boys slept in had blood on the exterior doorknob. Given the violent nature of the scene, investigators were surprised that almost no one from the resort recalled hearing any noise during the night, not even next door in cabin 27, which was only 15 feet away. One couple who lived in another nearby cabin claimed they were awoken at around 1:30 a.m. by what they thought might be muffled screaming, but they soon fell back asleep. Investigators attempted to look into John and Dana's whereabouts on the evening of April the 11th. Witnesses did recall seeing the two boys in Quincy, and the last known sighting of them occurred at around 10 p.m. when they were seen hitchhiking in front of the Gold Pan Motel. However, it could not be established if John and Dana were given a ride back to cabin 28, and no one knew what time they arrived. This created speculation that whoever picked them up hitchhiking might have been responsible for the crime. Police would explore the theory that the murders may have been drug-related, as there were uncorroborated rumors that Sue sold drugs to make ends meet, or that John and Dana had recently stolen some LSD from local drug dealers. However, no illegal drugs or drug paraphernalia was found inside the cabin, and autopsies found no traces of drugs inside any of the victims' systems, so this theory was ultimately dismissed. In spite of the tumultuous nature of their marriage, Sue's ex-husband, James Sharp, was ruled out as a suspect, as he had an alibi placing him in Connecticut when the crime took place. Sue had recently started dating another man, but he was also ruled out once it was established that he was in another town that night. Rick, Greg, and Justin all claimed to have gone to bed at around 10 p.m., but even though they slept in an adjacent room and the door was found partially open, Rick and Greg would maintain that they did not see or hear anything related to the murders. But with Justin, things were a lot more complicated. At first, he would claim that he had a vivid dream about being on a boat and witnessing two men violently attack Sue, John, and Dana before dumping the two boys' bodies overboard. Justin then went over to Sue's body and tried to stop the bleeding on a slit in her chest. Well, the problem is that Justin's description was so vivid that it contained details which matched the actual crime scene, such as the fact that Sue had a blanket over her body. But if Justin slept through the murders, he shouldn't have seen the crime scene, since he exited the cabin through the bedroom window and never went in the living room. As you recall, Justin supposedly tried to tell a detective that Tina was missing when he was initially questioned, but how could he have possibly known that at the time? The detail about this attack taking place on a boat might have had something to do with Justin having watched an episode of The Love Boat on TV in the cabin before he went to bed. However, Justin later changed his story and said that he believed he witnessed the actual murders. He was placed under hypnosis on 2 separate occasions and shared a story about being woken up by a noise and peeking into the living room through the bedroom door. Justin described seeing 2 men with Sue before John and Dana entered the cabin. An argument quickly ensued which escalated into violence, and the 3 victims were tied up and murdered. Justin then claimed that Tina exited her bedroom carrying a blanket while the attack was taking place, so the 2 men grabbed her and took her out the back door. One of the men then returned and placed Tina's blanket over Sue's body before they left, and Justin eventually went back to bed. The 2 men were described as being in their late 20s or early 30s. One of them had a mustache and short hair, the other was clean-shaven with longer, shoulder-length hair, and they both wore gold-framed sunglasses. Once again, Justin provided specific details which seemed to match the actual murders, but there were parts of his story which didn't ring true. For instance, since blood was found inside Sue and Tina's bedroom, this seemed to suggest that they were attacked in there before Tina came running out. There was also some doubt if Justin would have been able to see everything he described from the position he stood behind the bedroom door. While some people doubted the veracity of Justin's story, composite sketches were generated of the 2 men and circulated throughout the media. Anyway, the surviving Sharp children, Sheila, Rick, and Greg, would all be placed in foster care. The investigation remained at a standstill for 3 years, but in April of 1984, a bottle collector was walking through a remote area of Plumas National Forest in the unincorporated community of Camp 18, located in Butte County near the town of Feather Falls. He came across the top portion of a human skull and immediately contacted the Butte County Sheriff's Office. A subsequent search of this area would later turn up a lower mandible jawbone. Within 2 months, dental records would officially confirm that the remains belonged to Tina Sharp. However, her official cause of death could not be determined, but an anthropologist who examined the remains concluded that Tina likely died sometime between when she originally went missing on April 12, 1981, and the fall of 1983. The area where the remains were found was over 50 miles away from Keddie, and interestingly enough, just over a mile or so from the line which separated Butte County from Plumas County. This officially brought the number of victims in the Keddie Cabin murders to 4, but unfortunately, it failed to bring the case any closer to a resolution. The murders gave the Keddie Resort a ton of extra notoriety, but they closed down for good in 2004, and the scene of the crime, Cabin 28, was condemned and torn down. However, it was around this same time that the Keddie Cabin murders started to garner extra exposure and finally put some promising suspects into the public spotlight. If you go on YouTube, you'll find a documentary titled Cabin 28, The Keddie Murders, which was made by an English teacher named Josh Hancock in 2004. Years later, he produced a sequel containing new information, which is also available for viewing on YouTube. During this time period, an extensive website was launched about the case at keddie28.com, which contains years' worth of investigative research. Now, before I talk about the documentary, I have to add a disclaimer that the people who run the Keddie28 website believe that the film is filled with misinformation, but I'll address these issues later on. Anyway, long story short, the documentary revealed the names of the 2 prime suspects, Martin Smartt, who went by the name Marty, and a friend of his named Severin John Bobade, who usually went by his nickname, Bo. Here's William McCormick to tell us more about them.
Marty Smartt happened to be Justin Smartt's stepfather and lived in Cabin 26 with Justin's mother, Marilyn, and her other son from a previous marriage, Casey. Marty had been employed as a cook at the Keddie Resort's restaurant, though he lost his job shortly before the murders. In March 1981, Marty was staying in the psychiatric unit of the Veterans Administration Hospital in Reno, Nevada. He had served in the Vietnam War and claimed that he suffered from PTSD, though there has been some debate to the validity of this, as Marty's tour consisted of working as a cook on a military base near Saigon, and it doesn't sound like he saw any action. It was during his stay at the hospital that Marty became acquainted with Bo Bobade. Both men had criminal records, as Bo had served time in prison for armed robbery, and he had allegedly been involved with organized crime in Chicago. When they left the hospital, Marty invited Bo to stay with him and his family at the Keddie Resort, so Bo had been living in Cabin 26 for 10 days at the time the murders took place.
Anyway, both Marilyn Smartt and her now grown-up son Justin were interviewed in the Cabin 28 documentary. By this point, Justin seemed convinced that he had witnessed the murders or the aftermath, but had no clear-cut memories of what actually happened. Marilyn, on the other hand, firmly believed that Marty and Bo were the killers and revealed a number of incriminating pieces of information. Now, keep in mind that this is all Marilyn's version of events, but here's what she said. According to Marilyn, Marty was very violent and abusive towards her and her children. Sue had apparently been trying to convince Marilyn to end the marriage, which may have provided a potential motive for Marty to kill her. On the evening of April 11, 1981, while Justin was staying in Cabin 28, Marilyn, Marty, and Bo all went to a local establishment called the Backdoor Bar and arrived at 10 p.m. Marilyn claimed that the 2 men asked her to invite Sue to come along since Bo was looking for a date, but Sue declined. Sometime between 12:30 and 1 a.m., Bo became angry because the bar changed the music and started playing rock instead of country, so he made a stink about it before the group left together. When they returned to the cabin, Marty and Bo decided they wanted to go back to the bar for a nightcap and left again, but Marilyn elected to stay behind and went to bed. She then claimed that she woke up sometime after 2 a.m., heard some noise outside the bedroom, and checked to see the 2 men burning something in a wood stove. When Marilyn learned about the murders later that morning, she instantly suspected that Marty and Bo may have been responsible. In the documentary, Justin and Marilyn both shared a story about how a short time after the crime took place, Justin was playing on the floor with his brother Casey when Casey made a stabbing motion and Justin grabbed his arm and said, "I have to protect Sue." When Marty saw this, he grabbed Justin and said, "You will never talk about this again," before taking him outside for a private conversation. After this, Justin no longer talked about the crime around his family. During her interview, Marilyn also claimed that she had found a bloody jacket in her basement, which may have belonged to Tina Sharp, and turned it over to the police, but no record of this exists. There are also unconfirmed reports that when Justin returned to his own cabin on the morning of the murders, Marilyn noticed blood on his shoes and turned them over to the police, but they subsequently went missing. Again, there doesn't seem to be any official record of this. Anyway, Marty and Bo left town immediately after the murders with another friend who drove Bo back to the VA hospital in Reno. Marty spent the night in a neighboring town with a friend named Glenna Meeks, who recounted the experience in the documentary. Meeks claimed that Marty appeared to be high on drugs and that he spent the night frantically pacing around, saying, "I gotta go to Keddie, I started something I gotta finish," before he left at around 4 a.m. the following morning. Marilyn and her 2 kids moved out of cabin 26 on the same day the murders were discovered, and she would file for divorce with Marty within weeks. Now, Doug Thomas, the Plumas County Sheriff at this time, was also interviewed in the Cabin 28 documentary, and he expressed skepticism about Marty and Bo being the perpetrators. He claimed that he and the California Department of Justice interviewed both men and that Marty passed a polygraph. In the end, they did not find any evidence to make them believe that either man was involved in the crime and did not consider them to be suspects. By the time the documentary was released, Marty and Bo were no longer around to refute the allegations against them. Bo died in Chicago in 1988, while Marty succumbed to cancer while living in Portland, Oregon in 2000. All that being said, many people disagreed with Sheriff Thomas's assessment of Marty, as the 2 men were apparently good friends prior to the murders. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office's initial investigation faced heavy criticism as they failed to secure the crime scene, and many key pieces of evidence would be lost, overlooked, or improperly handled. In particular, their failure to launch an immediate search effort for Tina Sharp came under heavy attack. In fact, the investigation from both the Sheriff's Office and the California DOJ proved so inadequate that there were allegations that a cover-up took place. The sequel to the Cabin 28 documentary would contain an interview with Marty Smart's therapist at the VA hospital who shared a stunning story. On April 27, 1981, Marty actually revealed during one of his therapy sessions that he was responsible for the deaths of Sue and Tina Sharp, though he denied responsibility for the murders of John and Dana. He said that he was angry with Sue for turning his wife against him and ruining his marriage, and that the only reason Tina was killed was because she was a witness. By this point, Marty had already passed his polygraph test, but he bragged that polygraphs were easy to beat. The therapist subsequently contacted agents from the DOJ and informed them about Marty's confession, but for whatever reason, this lead was not followed up on. But that's not all. Around the same time period, after learning about Marilyn's decision to divorce him, Marty sent her a letter from Klamath Falls, Oregon, asking her to get back together with him. But this line really stood out. Quote, "I paid the price for your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives. You tell me we are through. Great. What else do you want?" End quote. Marilyn claimed that she did not remember receiving the letter, but it somehow did wind up in the hands of the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, where for reasons unknown, it was subsequently set aside and not followed up on. And believe it or not, this would not be the last instance of misplaced evidence. In 2013, the current Plumas County Sheriff, Greg Hagwood, decided to reopen the case. Hagwood was a teenager at the time the crime took place, and had even shared a class with John Sharp and Dana Wingate. He decided to consult with a retired special investigator named Mike Gamberg, who had worked as a deputy for the Plumas County Sheriff's Office prior to the murders. Gamberg was assigned the task of reorganizing all the material the Sheriff's Office had about the case, and while going through evidence boxes, he made a surprising discovery: a recording of an anonymous phone call. In 1984, shortly after the discovery of Tina Sharp's remains made the news, the Butte County Sheriff's Office dispatch received a call from an unidentified man. By this point, the remains had not yet been identified, so the caller put forward the idea that they might belong to a 12-year-old girl who went missing in Keddie 3 years earlier before he abruptly hung up. This call was not documented, and when Gamberg discovered the recording, it was inside a sealed envelope which had been kept in an evidence box for nearly 3 decades. This, along with many other mistakes he uncovered, prompted Gamberg to publicly express his dissatisfaction with the original investigation, stating, quote, "You could take someone just coming out of the academy and they would have done a better job." End quote. In March of 2016, a rusted hammer was discovered at the bottom of a dried-up pond near the former entrance to the Keddie Resort. The hammer was found by a man who had been using a metal detector to search for a woman's lost ring, and he thought it might be significant, so he contacted the administrator of the Keddie 28 website, known only as DMAC, who subsequently passed the tip along to the police. Remember, even though it was suspected that 2 different hammers were used on the victims, only one of them was found at the scene. And when Marty Smartt was questioned by investigators following the murders, without being asked, he told them that he believed a claw hammer had gone missing from his home, and the hammer found in the dried-up pond just happened to match the description he provided. Sheriff Hagwood was quoted as saying, "The location it was found, it would have been intentionally put there. It would not have accidentally been misplaced." And there would be one final development earlier this year. Here's Stephanie Kurtz to share it.
In April 2018, Mike Gamberg announced that DNA was recovered from a piece of medical tape found on the floor of the crime scene next to Sue's body, and that it had just been matched to a known suspect who is still living. Even though Marty Smartt and Bo Bidet are currently deceased, both Gamberg and Sheriff Hagwood believe that as many as 6 people may have been involved, if not with the actual murders, then with the cover-up and disposal of evidence. So theoretically, someone could still be charged for their role in this crime. But for the moment at least, the Keddie Cabin murders continue to officially remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold.
So you can see why a terrifying murder case such as this would be an ideal topic for our Halloween episode, and since it garnered the most votes in our poll, you folks obviously felt the same way. Cabin in the Woods murders are a popular trope in horror films, and the Keddie murders is undoubtedly the most famous real-life example of a cabin in the woods crime. You can certainly understand why true crime fans would be drawn to this story, but the surprising thing is that it really didn't seem to capture widespread attention until 2 decades after the crime took place. Don't get me wrong, it did get a decent amount of media coverage at the time, but not as much as you would think, given that it involved the very brutal and sadistic murders of 3 people, 2 of them teenage boys, and the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl. I read in one article that there were plans to feature the case on Unsolved Mysteries, but plans were scrapped because of a lack of funds to do the necessary traveling. I think the story really seemed to gain notoriety following the release of the 2008 horror film The Strangers. It was billed as being quote-unquote inspired by true events, and some online sleuths seem to think that it was based on the Keddie Cabin murders. However, this really isn't true, as the movie's plot involves a married couple being terrorized inside their vacation home by 3 masked intruders, but there are no real similarities at all to the Keddie case, and the film's director has never claimed it was an inspiration. Regardless, the frequent mention of the case alongside The Strangers, combined with the launch of the Keddie 28 website and the release of the Cabin 28 documentary on YouTube, really seemed to put the Keddie murders into the consciousness of the true crime community, and it's now one of the more heavily discussed cold cases on the internet. It's now been covered on a number of podcasts, TV specials, and YouTube series, and you folks clearly wanted to see it on The Trail Went Cold. Yet unlike many other famous unsolved murders, there seems to be an overall consensus about who the killer was, as the vast majority of people believe that Marty Smartt and Bo Bidet committed this crime. And of course, since they're both currently deceased, they will never face justice. It sounds like a number of people believe those 2 were responsible right from the outset, but they were never actually named publicly as potential suspects until years after they died. If you look at the early media coverage of this case, a lot of emphasis was placed on the fact that no one knew how John Sharp and Dana Wingate made it back to the cabin after spending the night in Quincy. So it would be easy to assume that the 2 boys were picked up while hitchhiking, and whoever drove them home followed them inside the cabin and proceeded to murder them and Sue before abducting Tina from the scene. However, during a series of articles published in the Plumas County News this past April, it was revealed that Sheriff Greg Hagwood was able to identify the person who drove John and Dana back home that night and interview them, and it doesn't look like they are considered a suspect. According to the Keddie 28 website, the person in question dropped them off at the entrance to the Keddie Resort and never came forward after learning about the murders because they feared they would be implicated by the police. During the initial stages of the investigation, there were a lot of unsubstantiated rumors that Sue Sharp was involved in drugs and prostitution and that this paved the way to her being murdered, but this also turned out to be untrue. Given the sheer brutality of the crime, it always seemed more likely that the murders were very personal in nature and committed by someone who had an intense hatred for the victims. I can tell you straight out that I totally believe that Marty and Bo were the perpetrators, but there are still a ton of unanswered questions in this story. What was their motive? Why did they abduct Tina from the scene? Were other people involved in the murders? Did law enforcement orchestrate a cover-up? Could the surviving kids from the cabin have witnessed or even participated in the crime? When it comes to motive, I think it would depend on how much stock you put into Marilyn Smart's claims that Sue was trying to convince her to end her abusive marriage to Marty, which caused him to lash out at her. On the surface, this doesn't seem implausible, as Sue had just escaped her own abusive marriage 18 months earlier. Even though Sue was described by the other residents of the Keddie Resort as a reclusive person who mostly kept to herself, I could see her wanting to intervene in the Smarts' abusive relationship if she saw the warning signs. Marilyn finally divorced Marty only weeks after the murders, so if she suspected he was responsible, that could have been the final nail in the coffin of the marriage. But on the other hand, there are some people, particularly those who run the Keddie 28 website, who do not believe Marilyn's story at all. Believe it or not, they have accused Marilyn of being the real mastermind behind the murders, and think she was present alongside Marty and Bo in Cabin 28 that night. The motive? She discovered that Sue and Marty had been having an affair. Needless to say, this is a theory which has been the source of a lot of controversy, but I'll delve into it in a little while. If Marilyn was involved, it might seem pretty brazen for her to agree to be interviewed in the Cabin 28 documentary, but remember, this was not filmed until after Marty and Bo were already dead, so they were no longer around to refute any of the accusations she made towards them. This is why the Keddie 28 website has always been so critical of the documentary, believing that they gave Marilyn an outlet to spread misinformation which painted herself in the best possible light and absolved her of any involvement in the crime. Well, before I share my own personal thoughts about this matter, I want to examine the timeline and the logistics of how these murders would have been carried out. It seems very likely that the crime was premeditated and not a spur-of-the-moment rage-type killing. The main piece of evidence supporting this is the medical tape which was used to bind the victims, as this tape did not originate from Cabin 28, so the killers clearly brought it with them with the intention of inflicting a very torturous and brutal death. Sue also had the imprint from the butt of a BB rifle on her head, another weapon which the killers brought with them that was never found. It's also been theorized that Marty and Bo's trip to the backdoor bar that night may have been an attempt to fabricate an alibi for themselves. Even though Marilyn claims that the two men asked her to invite Sue to come along with them to the bar and that Sue declined, some people suspect that she completely made up this story. What's particularly interesting is that Marty and Bo both decided to wear sunglasses and three-piece suits to the bar, as this does not sound like the type of establishment where people typically dressed up like that. This may have been done specifically to draw attention to themselves and make an impression, so that witnesses would remember seeing them there that night. There's also the fact that Bo decided to make a scene and prompt everyone to leave over something as trivial as the bar deciding to play rock music instead of country. Again, this may have been done to draw attention to themselves and create potential alibi witnesses. Before they returned to the bar, Marty also phoned the bar owner from the cabin to complain about the music selection, so it really seems like they were going out of their way to be noticed. However, Marty and Bo said they left shortly before the bar closed at 2 a.m., and the bodies were not discovered until 6 hours later. Since we have no idea of the exact time the murders took place, the presence of Marty and Bo at the bar is hardly an airtight alibi. As you recall, Marilyn claimed that she woke up around 2 a.m. and saw the two men burning something in a wood stove. If she's telling the truth, they could have been destroying bloody clothing, as Marilyn claimed that she never saw the three-piece suit Marty wore again. The one thing which is very clear about this crime is that whoever murdered Sue wanted to inflict as much suffering as possible upon her. While there were no signs of sexual assault, she was nude from the waist down and was gagged with her own panties, which I'm sure was intended as some form of humiliation. What's not so clear is how the deaths of John and Dana came about, and if the perpetrators always planned on killing them. It's possible that they were already there before the two boys got home, and that they walked in while Sue was being attacked. However, while the other children slept in adjacent bedrooms, John slept in an unfinished downstairs room which did not have an internal stairwell. This meant that if John wanted to enter the main cabin, he would have to walk outside and enter through the front door or the back stairs. When the intruders arrived, they may not have been aware that John and Dana were already downstairs at that point. If the two boys heard something, they could have tried entering the cabin to see what was going on before they were overpowered and tied up alongside Sue. One of the creepiest details about the murder scene is that Sue had blood on her bare feet, and there were bare bloody footprints in the living room, so the killers could have walked Sue around and made her watch them murder her children before they killed her too. This scenario was even more disturbing if Tina was murdered inside the cabin as well. Remember, Tina originally wanted to join her sister and sleep over with Sheila in cabin 27, but her mother wouldn't give her permission. Now, in Justin's memories of the event, he recalls seeing Tina walk out of her bedroom while the murders were taking place before she was grabbed and taken out the back door, but the physical evidence does not support this scenario. There was blood found inside the bedroom which Sue and Tina shared together, so Sue may have already been sleeping in her bed when the intruders entered the cabin and attacked her. If this is how things played out, then Tina would have been awakened immediately. It's been up for debate whether Tina was killed after she was abducted or if she was murdered in the cabin that night alongside the others. If it's the latter scenario, you might be wondering why the perpetrators would go to the trouble of removing her body from the scene. She was not found until 3 years later, and was nothing but skeletal remains by then, so it was impossible to determine her exact cause of death, or if she had been sexually assaulted. But there are three possibilities here. A. Since she was a young girl, the perpetrator wanted to abduct Tina and take her to another location to have their way with her before killing her. B. The intruders hadn't initially planned on killing Tina and weren't sure if they wanted to murder a child, but since she was a witness, they decided to take her away so they could figure out what to do. Or C. Tina's abduction was a deliberate attempt at misdirection. Personally, I'm inclined to lean towards C. I think the reason for taking Tina's body away from the scene was to give off the impression that she was the intended target, not Sue, and that the perpetrator was some murderous pedophile. This idea did have some basis in reality, as Tina had allegedly been molested by a man several months earlier while she was living in the trailer park in Quincy, though no charges were ever filed, and this man was determined to have had no involvement in her abduction. But if the strategy was to create misdirection, it technically worked, because noted FBI profiler John Douglas was brought in to create a profile of the perpetrator, and he believed that the crime was driven by an obsession with Tina. Her remains were ultimately discovered in a remote area located over 50 miles away, so this may have been an attempt to lead the investigation away from Keddie and make everyone believe the killer didn't live in the area. I also have to wonder if they chose that specific location because it was in Butte County, right over the Plumas County line, so the discovery of the remains could cause potential jurisdictional issues. When the discovery of the remains made the news, I'm sure it couldn't have been a coincidence that someone made an anonymous phone call to the police, telling them to look into the girl who went missing in Keddie 3 years earlier. I've heard the audio of the call, and I've also heard audio of Bo Bobaday being interrogated by the DOJ in the Cabin 28 documentary, and it sounds like they could be the same voice, but the quality of the recordings is not good enough to say for sure, and thus far, the caller has never been conclusively identified. It's interesting how right after the murders, Marty was staying at Glenna Meeks' place out of town, and apparently spent the night frantically pacing around saying, "I gotta go to Keddie, I started something I gotta finish." That's a sign that he needed to return there to dispose of potential evidence, and you could easily infer that it had something to do with Tina, as it's unclear when exactly she was taken to that remote area in Butte County. I don't know if Tina was murdered inside the cabin or murdered elsewhere after she was abducted, but I really hope she didn't go through as prolonged an ordeal as Sue, John, and Dana did. So we now have to discuss why the other three people inside the cabin that night Rick, Greg, and Justin were spared. Everyone believes that one of the creepiest aspects of this case is that such a brutal crime could take place in an area where many people lived, but aside from a couple who thought they heard a muffled scream at one point, no one heard a thing. The Seabolt's cabin was located only 15 feet away from Cabin 28, and it must have been a pretty helpless feeling for the victims, knowing that their nearest neighbors were so close, yet they were apparently completely oblivious to what was happening. But the thing which has been endlessly debated is whether Ricky, Greg, and Justin all managed to sleep through these brutal murders as they took place in the very next room, or if they actually saw or heard something. While Sheila Sharp has become a major advocate for her family and frequently makes media appearances about the case, Rick and Greg have completely shied away from the spotlight. It's not hard to imagine why, but they've apparently always stuck to their story that they never saw anything. But if either of them did, it's possible they may have completely blocked the entire experience from their memories. That does seem to be the case with Justin, as he initially provided eyewitness accounts of seeing something, but no one is certain just how much of it has a basis in reality. Like I mentioned earlier, Justin was interviewed for the Cabin 28 documentary 2 decades after the fact, and claims that he really isn't sure what happened that night, though he has doubts that he simply slept through the whole thing. Now, the fact that Justin, Rick, and Greg survived the night is another piece of evidence which points to Marty Smartt being the perpetrator. I don't think anyone sadistic enough to commit such a brutal crime would have many qualms about killing every single person inside the cabin, even if they were children. If Marty had such an intense hatred for Sue and wanted to make her suffer, he might have been inclined to murder Rick and Greg right in front of her, but the only reason he didn't do that is because they were sharing a room with his stepson. Since there were traces of blood found on the exterior doorknob to the boys' bedroom, and the door was partially open, there's no way the perpetrators wouldn't have known they were sleeping in there. The composite sketches of the 2 men Justin described have become pretty infamous, and many people rank them among the creepiest composite sketches they've ever seen. But people have been divided about how useful they really were. Some believe that if you look at the top half of one sketch and combine it with the bottom half of the other, they would have a closer resemblance to Marty and Bo. I'm inclined to agree, because the suspect with the mustache has short hair, while the clean-shaven suspect has longer hair, even though Marty, who had a mustache, had shoulder-length hair which was longer than Bo's. Looking at the original media accounts of the case, I don't see any mention of Marty Smartt and Bo Bobaday. They were questioned, and some people thought they were the likely perpetrators, but as far as I can tell, they were never outed publicly as suspects until the release of the Cabin 28 documentary, and of course by that point, they were already dead. But when you look at the circumstances of how everything played out, it seems pretty incredible that Marty and Bo didn't become the prime suspects right from the start. There were a number of noticeable red flags when they were questioned by the Plumas County Sheriff's Office and the California DOJ on April 14th, 2 days after the murders. For instance, when discussing Justin's presence at Cabin 28 that night, Marty actually stated, quote, "There is a very high possibility that he could have been awake or alerted to something unusual, and he is quiet enough that he could have noticed something without me detecting him," end quote. But no one called Marty out for that odd slip of the tongue. When Marty mentioned that he believed a claw hammer he owned had gone missing, it seemed like he was preemptively covering his tracks and trying to provide a potential explanation in case one of the missing murder weapons was ever found and traced back to him. And sure enough, a hammer just like the one he described was found in a dried-up pond in 2016. When questioned by the DOJ, Bo contradicted himself many times. For example, at the start of the interview, he mentioned that the Sharps lived in Cabin 28, but later on, claims that he didn't know where they lived. He changed his story about the exact time he arrived at the backdoor bar on the night of the murders, lied about never having met Sue Sharp beforehand, and for some odd reason, claimed that Marilyn was his niece. It's possible that the DOJ agents let these discrepancies slide because Bo told them beforehand that he was a former Chicago police officer who had to retire after he was shot in the groin, but this was not true at all. But was this simply incompetent investigative work on the part of the DOJ and the Sheriff's Office? Or was there a deliberate cover-up? It's not hard to believe it might have been the latter, especially when you consider how many key pieces of evidence pointing to Marty and Bo, such as Marty's letter to Marilyn and his confession to his therapist were completely buried for decades. All things considered, this case should have been closed within weeks. I know that Sheriff Doug Thomas and Marty Smartt were good friends prior to the murders, but I don't care how close you are. Would you really go the extra mile to protect someone who committed a crime this heinous? To this day, Sheriff Thomas still maintains that he does not believe Marty and Bo were the killers. Well, one theory which has been pushed around is that the cover-up was orchestrated in order to protect Bo. Details about Bo's background are pretty murky, but we do know he was an ex-con who had alleged ties to organized crime. One thing which has always struck people as curious is that when the Plumas County Sheriff's Office called in the California DOJ for assistance, they sent agents from their organized crime unit, not their homicide unit, even though there was no indication that the Keddie murders had anything to do with organized crime. These same agents were the ones who took the statement from Marty's therapist about his alleged confession, but for reasons unknown, they never acted upon it. The conspiracy theory about the DOJ protecting Bo because of his involvement with organized crime and the drug trade has been pushed forward by DMAC, the owner of the Keddie 28 website, and Mike Gamberg has said that he is inclined to agree with it. I don't know. Considering that at the time these murders took place, Bo seemed to be something of a drifter who was crashing on the couch of a guy he just met, I have to wonder just how connected this guy really was, and if he was important enough for law enforcement to just brush aside his involvement in a crime in which 4 people, 3 of whom were underage children, were brutally murdered. Don't get me wrong, I have no trouble believing there was a cover-up, and that someone in power went out of their way to ensure that Marty and Bo would never be charged for their roles in the murders, as a lot of the so-called mistakes in the investigation do seem to be intentional. But since neither of them are still around, I'm not sure we'll ever learn the truth about why they were allowed to get away with it. Now, given that the 2 prime suspects are currently dead, you might be wondering if there's anything that can still be done to solve this crime. Well, in recent years, investigators have announced that they believe that up to 6 people may have been involved in either the murders or the cover-up, so they're still working on it. Earlier this year, they specifically announced that DNA which matched a still living suspect was found on one of the pieces of medical tape in the cabin, though they haven't announced who this suspect is, or if any steps are being taken to arrest them in the near future. But who else could have been involved besides Bo and Marty? While I won't speculate too much on other potential suspects, but like I mentioned earlier, there are some people who suspect that Marilyn Smartt was present in Cabin 28 when the murders took place and directly participated. Not only that, but she decided to mastermind the whole thing after discovering that Sue and Marty were having an affair. You could read something into this line from the letter Marty wrote to Marilyn after she decided to divorce him. I paid the price for your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through. Marty could very well be implying that Marilyn ordered him to commit these murders as penance for his affair with Sue, but she still decided to end the marriage anyway. Of course, this is a letter written by a violent, mentally unstable individual with a history of abuse, so he could very well be rationalizing his actions by blaming Marilyn for his crime, even though she had nothing to do with it. Now, I'm not saying that I personally believe the theory that Marilyn masterminded the murders, but I have to address it. This is the primary reason that the Cabin 28 documentary faced such heavy criticism from the Keddie 28 website, as they did not believe a single word Marilyn said during her interviews, and believed she was fabricating her stories in order to point all the suspicion towards Marty and Bo, who were deceased at the time, in order to absolve herself of any responsibility. But here are some issues I have with this theory. Number 1, it seems pretty brazen for Marilyn to leave Marty and divorce him immediately following the murders, since he could easily implicate her out of spite. Number 2, Marty never mentioned anything about Marilyn being involved during his confession to his therapist, only saying that Sue had turned his wife against him. Keep in mind that Marty probably mistakenly assumed that his therapist would never contact the authorities about this because of doctor-patient confidentiality, so he had no reason to hold anything back in his sessions. If he was angry that Marilyn had roped him into committing some murders and then decided to leave him anyway, it's surprising that he wouldn't have vented about that. And number 3, if both Marty and Marilyn were complicit in the murders, why would they have allowed Justin to spend the night in cabin 28 in the first place? It seems to me that if Marilyn knew a crime was going to be taking place there, she would have told her son he had to stay home. Why run the huge risk of intentionally allowing Justin to be a witness? It makes a lot more sense to me that Marty would let Justin, Rick, and Greg live because he knew he couldn't murder his stepson if he hoped to maintain any relationship with Marilyn. Even if for some sadistic reason Marilyn wanted Justin to be present when the murders took place, why spare Rick and Greg and leave 2 more witnesses alive who could implicate her? I guess my biggest issue with the entire theory is that it accuses Sue Sharp of having an affair with a married man, and I hate to throw accusations like that at murder victims without definitive proof. Don't get me wrong, there have been inconsistencies in Marilyn's stories over the years, and it seems strange that she supposedly kept turning in key pieces of evidence to the police which went missing, yet there's no record of this. Even if she was not actively involved in the murders, it's possible that at the very least, Marilyn knows more than she let on. And keep in mind, we still don't know who the DNA from the medical tape belongs to. If it matches Marilyn, that might not necessarily prove that she participated in the murders. The perpetrators brought the medical tape with them, but if it originated from cabin 26, Marilyn could have conceivably touched it and gotten her DNA on it on a separate occasion prior to the murders before Marty brought it to cabin 28. Whoever's DNA it is, it has been several months since they made a match, and no arrests have been made, so it might not be strong enough evidence on its own to charge someone for their role in the murders. Another possibility is that the DNA might belong to Justin. During the so-called dream Justin described, he mentioned placing a blanket over Sue's body, so if that has any basis in reality and something like that really happened, Justin could have potentially gotten his DNA on the tape. Since Justin and the other 2 boys exited the cabin through the bedroom window and never walked through the living room, then the presence of Justin's DNA at the murder scene would mean he had to have been there while the crime was taking place. We may never know just how much Justin actually witnessed that night, or if he may have been forced against his will to participate. Only Justin knows for sure, but the trauma could have been so strong that he's completely blocked these events from his mind, and he might not even know which of his memories are based on fantasy or reality. If Justin's DNA is present at the scene, then this creates an interesting legal hurdle. He was only 12 years old at the time, and if he was directly involved, then there are definitely extenuating circumstances, and he's just as much a victim as the people who were killed. I think the biggest chance for closure in this case is if Justin were to reveal everything that happened, but who knows how reliable his memories would be. I think virtually everyone who has studied this case can say with full certainty that Marty Smartt and Bo Bobaday were the killers and managed to escape justice, but if they were the sole perpetrators, then it will be almost impossible to learn the full truth about what happened and give this case 100% closure. But if there are other living suspects who are directly involved and can still be prosecuted for their role in this crime, then the case is still solvable. So if you happen to have any information on the Keddie Cabin murders, please contact the Plumas County Sheriff's Office at 530-283-6360. That's 530-283-6360. Anyway, that about does it for our special Halloween episode. Another big thanks to Kelly Campbell, Stuart Davis, William McCormick, and Stephanie Kurtz for doing such a great job with their narration. Of course, per tradition, we're going to be continuing our listener voiceover contest and doing a random draw each month to give one of our fans the opportunity to narrate the opening of a future episode. If you've already entered this contest before, you are automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you want to enter and haven't already done so, all you have to do is send an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. So once again, send an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that the Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've released some exclusive bonus episodes for our donors in tiers 2 and 3, and this month, we did a special supernatural-themed Halloween episode about the Teresita Bassa case, the real-life story of a murder victim who supposedly returned from the grave to name her killer. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a special shout-out to our newest listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Laura B., Lily Y., Reno, and David M. And this past month, I've been taking the opportunity to thank more of our listeners who have been with us on Patreon since we launched there nearly 7 months ago, and I've been thanking you all in increments of 20. So this week, I'd like to thank Paul R., Vincent T., Whitney G., Michelle W., Heather P., Sean M., Liam P., Jay Browner, Yanni U., Mary F., Brian N., Micah, Ali C., Angelica B., Vanessa B., Michael J., Derek W., Amber S., Sean G., and Rob M. And before we bring things to a close, I'd like to play a promo for one of my favorite true crime podcasts, Criminology, which has recently launched its 4th season. Have a listen.
Hi, this is Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford.
And we'd like to invite you to check out our true crime podcast, Criminology.
In each season of Criminology, we take a deep dive to tackle some of the biggest cases in the history of true crime, using classified police files and interviews with investigators, experts, victims, and survivors, all in an effort to accurately and completely examine the cases we cover.
And season 4 of Criminology is out right now. We're taking on cases solved in 2018 using DNA with the help of resources like Parabon, GEDmatch, and forensic genealogy. And we've got some great interviews this season with people like Paul Holes, who helped bring down the Golden State Killer, Curtis Rogers, founder of GEDmatch, Steve Armentrout, the CEO of Parabon, and Colleen Fitzpatrick, a forensic genealogist who's had a hand in solving some of these cases.
Past seasons of Criminology are available to binge, including in-depth coverage of the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer, and Ted Bundy.
New episodes drop Saturdays at 10 o'clock p.m., and you can find and subscribe to Criminology on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So I hope you've enjoyed all our special Halloween-themed episodes we've presented throughout the month of October. It was a blast to put them all together. So everyone have yourselves a happy Halloween, and join me next week for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.